He called her out to humiliate her in front of his wealthy guests. But when she touched the piano, the room fell completely silent. Savannah heat doesn't play fair in July. The kind of thick air that sticks to your back makes your clothes feel heavier than they are. Beverly Gaines stood outside the iron gate of 742 Prospect Lane with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the smallest hint of hesitation in her chest. Not fear, not nerves, just a pause. A quiet breath before walking into someone else's world. She hadn't planned to work in a house like that. Not at this stage in her life. 48 years old, no kids, no husband. Just a one-bedroom apartment near Chatham Square and a voice that still sometimes sang in her sleep. But when her job at the dry cleaners shut down without warning, Beverly knew what time it was. Rent don't wait. So when the agency called and asked if she was available to clean for a private client, she said yes before they finished the sentence. The Whitlow estate was everything you'd expect from old Southern money. White columns, wraparound porch, boxwood hedges trimmed like they were drawn with a ruler. The kind of place where even the birds flew a little quieter. She walked up the steps, rang the bell, and the door opened almost instantly. "You're on time," the house manager said, glancing at her clipboard without offering a smile. "That's already better than the last girl." Beverly didn't take it personally. She never did. You couldn't afford to if you wanted to keep a job in someone else's home. You smile, you nod, you disappear into the background. The first few weeks were uneventful. She scrubbed tile, polished silver, learned where every switch and secret was hidden. She kept her head down, spoke when spoken to, and always said, "Sir," or "Ma'am." Mr. Whitlow barely looked at her. He was too busy entertaining lawyers, business folks, or women in high heels who always left before breakfast. It didn't matter. She wasn't there to be noticed. But one afternoon, as she dusted the second-floor hallway, she paused outside the music room. No one was inside, but the grand piano sat like a centerpiece in an empty banquet. Something in her hand itched, like muscle memory tugging on her fingers. She walked in, closed the door gently behind her, and sat down, just for a second. The keys were smooth. Not new, but well kept. She tapped one note, then another. Then something familiar took shape. A melody from childhood, her mother's favorite gospel hymn. She played just a few bars, slow and soft. She didn't hear the footsteps until the last note. "You know that thing's not part of your job description, right?" Beverly stood up like she'd been caught stealing. Mr. Whitlow leaned on the doorframe, wine glass in hand, smirking. He was the kind of man who never asked a question without already knowing the answer. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" "You play?" he interrupted. She looked down, just a little. "When I was young." He tilted his head like she'd said something amusing. "Huh. Who would have thought?" And then he left. Beverly didn't mention it again. She figured she'd pushed her luck. But she didn't know that moment had already planted something in his mind, something he'd use later, not to praise her, but to put her on display. Charles Whitlow never had to work for charm. He wore it like a second skin, polished, rehearsed, and just artificial enough to make it dangerous. At 56, he looked every bit the Southern gentleman he pretended to be. Linen suits in the summer, expensive shoes made for standing, not walking. His smile could sell lies without blinking. But under all that polish, there was a rot that only the staff seemed to notice. To the outside world, he was a philanthropist. Held fundraisers for the arts, donated to schools, hosted annual garden parties that made the society pages. He shook hands with judges and kissed babies at political events like he was running for something, even if he never said what. Inside the house, though, Charles ruled by mockery. The help existed for convenience, and the only thing he liked more than control was using it in ways that made people squirm. Beverly saw it early on. He never yelled, never raised his voice, but he had a talent for making people feel small without touching them. Once he'd asked the new chef if his fancy California training included how to make decent grits in front of 20 guests. Another time, he'd watched a gardener bend to pick up a fallen rose and muttered, "Careful now, Might throw your back out for minimum wage. Nobody confronted him. Nobody corrected him. He was Charles Whitlow. In this town, his name carried weight even the law didn't always question. Beverly tried to stay out of his way, but that wasn't always possible. He started testing her. At first, it was small things. "Gaines," he said one morning during breakfast prep, "you ever wear anything besides beige?" Or later, while sipping bourbon on the porch, "You sure are quiet. You ever talk or just glide around like a ghost?" She never took the bait, just kept working. Then, one evening, as she passed through the foyer carrying polished silver, he called out, "You still tickling those piano keys when nobody's looking?" Beverly paused. "No, sir." He smiled like he didn't believe her. "Shame. I bet that's a hoot." She walked away, throat tight but hands steady. Later, the other staff warned her about him. "That man's a snake," muttered Harold, the groundskeeper. "Feeds on weakness, don't let him find yours." But Whitlow didn't need to dig. He already had what he wanted. 2 weeks later, invitations started going out for his summer garden party. Beverly overheard the details while changing linens upstairs. It was going to be huge. Close to 100 guests, live jazz, wine flown in from Napa, the works. Staff doubled for the weekend. Every room scrubbed spotless. Everything had to be perfect. She'd worked big events before. She didn't mind the pressure. As long as no one looked at her too long, she could manage. But Whitlow had plans of his own. The night before the party, he stopped her in the hallway. "You know," he said, "tomorrow might be your moment." She looked at him, confused. He leaned in slightly, voice lower. "Don't be surprised if I ask you to play for the crowd. Just a little entertainment. It could be amusing." Her stomach twisted. "I'd rather not, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "Well, lucky for you, I wasn't asking." And just like that, it was decided. She didn't sleep that night, not because she feared embarrassment, but because she knew exactly what he wanted. A spectacle. And she wasn't sure whether to give it to him or take it away. By noon the next day, the Whitlow estate no longer looked like a home. It looked like a performance stage. White tents were raised over the manicured lawn. Tables draped in cream linen shimmered beneath dangling centerpieces of fresh orchids and calla lilies. Jazz musicians tuned their instruments on the terrace. Uniformed staff moved like clockwork, pouring wine, adjusting placements, folding napkins like origami. Beverly kept her head down, same as always. She set out canapes, helped polish stemware, and circled the perimeter with a tray of cucumber water and sweating ice cubes. No one looked her in the eye. She didn't mind. Being invisible was comfortable. Safe. But her hands weren't steady. It wasn't the piano that made her nervous. It was the reason. She knew Whitlow wasn't trying to give her a platform. He was preparing a punchline. She was the setup. By the time the clock hit 4:00 p.m., the guests started rolling in. Real estate developers, local judges, business owners, art patrons, and women with practiced smiles. They came in waves, hugging, laughing, sipping, name-dropping. From the shadow of the veranda, Beverly watched them glide across the lawn like they'd been born on polished marble. She didn't belong here. Not among these people. Not in this house. Not even in this city some days. But she wasn't here to belong. She was here to serve. By 6:15, the band had taken a break, and Charles Whitlow was feeling bold. 2 glasses of red in and a dozen compliments deep, he sauntered to the center of the lawn and raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, loud enough to pull eyes from all corners. "Before dinner is served, I thought we'd enjoy a bit of unexpected entertainment." Beverly froze. Her tray tilted slightly. Some guests clapped politely. Others looked around, unsure. Whitlow continued, his smile tight. "Turns out one of our very own staff members has a hidden talent." "Beverly?" Heads turned. She didn't move. He gestured grandly toward the open French doors leading to the music room. "Why don't you come play us something? You told me once you tinker with the piano. Let's hear it." The crowd chuckled. Not cruelly. Yet, but with the kind of amusement rich people save for adorable surprises. A few clapped. Others whispered. Beverly stood still, caught in that hot, heavy moment where you weigh the shame of refusal against the humiliation of obedience. But she didn't walk away. She handed her tray to the nearest server, wiped her palms on her apron, and walked inside. The guests followed, curious now. Inside the music room, the grand piano sat under soft lights, like it had been waiting all day. Beverly took her place on the bench, back straight, heart skipping. Silence filled the room. Charles leaned against the doorway, glass in hand, smug as ever. "Whenever you're ready." She looked at the keys. They stared back. Her fingers hovered. The room wasn't expecting music. They were expecting a joke, a clumsy tune, a wrong note. Something to laugh about later, something to make her small. But Beverly didn't start with jazz, or gospel, or anything flashy. She started with a lullaby her mother used to hum. Just 5 notes, delicate as breath. Then she built on it. Her hands moved slow, like waking something up. Minor chords melted into major ones. Gospel rhythms crept into classical phrasing. Jazz flourishes teased the edge of each transition. The room went quiet. Not out of politeness, but because no one knew what to say. One woman whispered, "Is this rehearsed?" Another, holding a flute of champagne mid-air, forgot to sip. Beverly didn't look up. She played like she was somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere remembered. And Whitlow, still by the door, wasn't smiling anymore. Not because his plan had failed, but because he realized she'd never been the joke. He had. There are moments in life when time forgets to move. That room, packed with expensive watches and practiced grins, stood perfectly still as Beverly Gaines poured pieces of her past into every note. She didn't play to impress. She didn't even play for the mom. She played because, for the first time in years, nobody was telling her who to be. Her fingers danced, not hesitantly, but with deep, silent certainty. Not showy, not fast, just honest. Her left hand carried the rhythm like steady breath. Her right hand told the story. Some chords rang with sorrow, others with defiance, others with quiet joy that made your chest tighten. Even those who didn't know music felt something pull inside them. The only sound was the music. No forks clinked, no phones rang, no whispering behind wine glasses. Just her, the piano, and 100 people holding their breath. In the corner, the band's saxophonist lowered his drink and leaned forward, jaw slightly parted. On the far side, a woman near tears whispered to her husband, "She's playing Duke Ellington. But that transition, did you hear that? That's gospel." Beverly didn't hear any of it. What she heard were footsteps from 20 years ago. Her mother pacing in their small kitchen in Tallahassee, humming as she stirred beans over a low flame. She remembered the cracked metronome on top of her childhood piano, the way her mother's hands trembled near the end, but never missed a beat when she played. She remembered quitting music the day after her mother passed. She remembered packing it away like a sweater that no longer fit. Until today. Today she let it back in. The final notes were quiet, not dramatic, not theatrical, just full, like a sentence that ends because it's complete. Then silence. Not awkward, not confused, just reverent. Then came the applause. It started with one person, an older man in the back, clapping slowly, eyes glassy. Then another. Then the whole room stood, not because it felt like the polite thing to do, but because their legs moved before their minds caught up. Beverly stood up from the bench. Her hands trembled now, not from nerves, but from something else. Something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. For once, the room looked at her not as a maid, not as background, but as someone who'd given them something real. Someone finally whispered, "Who is she?" Beverly didn't answer. She simply stepped away from the piano and nodded slightly. At no one, to no one, and walked toward the hallway. But someone blocked her path. It was Ava Renfield, a local arts patron known for curating talent across the South. She stepped forward, stunned. "That was..." Remarkable. Do you play professionally? No, Mom, Beverly replied, eyes low. Were you trained? Beverly paused. A long time ago. Ava blinked. Well, wherever it was, they should have built a stage around you. Others gathered. One guest asked if she taught lessons. Another offered her a card. One woman, with sincerity in her voice, said, "You made me feel something I haven't felt in years." Whitlow hadn't moved. He stood near the French doors, his smile nowhere in sight. His eyes locked on Beverly, but not with amusement, with something else. Embarrassment? Maybe. But it was pride he'd never get to claim. Beverly didn't wait for his reaction. She'd already given him more than he deserved, and taken back something she thought she'd buried for good. Outside, the party had picked up again. Waiters refilled champagne flutes. The jazz band returned to the terrace, but something was different now, like the rhythm had shifted. Like Beverly's music hadn't left the room entirely, but lingered in people's chests, right behind their ribs. Back inside, Beverly had gone to the kitchen. She didn't want attention. She didn't need praise. She just needed to breathe. She leaned against the counter, eyes on the floor, apron still tied. A few minutes passed. Then Harold, the groundskeeper, walked in. He didn't say much, just let out a low whistle and crossed his arms. "You sure know how to mess up a rich man's ego," he said, half smiling. Beverly gave a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't trying to do anything." "Exactly why it worked," he replied. She poured herself a glass of water. Her hands had steadied, but her heart was still catching up. Harold walked out after a moment. He wasn't one for long conversations, and Beverly appreciated that. Soon after, Charles Whitlow stepped into the kitchen. She didn't turn to face him. She didn't have to. He set his glass down harder than he needed to. "You made quite the impression." Beverly didn't respond. "I thought it'd be a fun little moment," he added. "Didn't expect you to turn it into a concert." Still, she said nothing. He leaned against the counter beside her. "You know what people are saying out there? That I've been hiding talent in my own house. Like I'm some villain in a made-for-TV movie." She met his eyes then. Calm. Clear. "You didn't hide me. You just never looked." His jaw twitched just once. "You think you embarrassed me?" "No, sir," she said softly. "You did that all by yourself." He stared at her for a second longer, then turned and walked away. The next day, the phone calls started. The woman from the Arts Council, a local music school, asking if she'd consider giving a master class. A retired producer wanting to take her to lunch. It was surreal. People who had passed her like wallpaper suddenly saw her as something else entirely. But Beverly didn't answer most of the calls. Not right away. She finished her duties for the week, just like she always did, cleaned the floors, folded the laundry, polished the silver. But something had changed in her steps. She wasn't trying to disappear anymore. That Friday afternoon, she walked into Whitlow's office and handed in her notice. 2 weeks. No explanation. He didn't ask for one. He just nodded, stared at the paper a second too long, and said, "Fine." She turned to leave. "You'll be back," he called after her. "They always come back." She paused in the doorway. "Maybe, but not to you." Outside the window, wind stirred the garden hedges. Guests would come and go, the staff would be replaced, and the parties would continue. But the memory of that afternoon would stay. Not because of the piano, but because the person he'd tried to reduce had quietly reminded everyone she wasn't his to measure, and he'd never be able to scrub that away. But Beverly wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was finally walking toward something, and it wasn't his house anymore. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Beverly Gaines walked out of 742 Prospect Lane for the last time. No big send-off, no gifts, no words from Charles Whitlow. Just the creak of the iron gate as she pulled it shut behind her, and the sun warming her shoulders as she stepped into the street. She carried the same canvas bag she had brought that first day. But she was different now, and not because of what the guests had said, or the applause, or the sudden wave of interest in her talent. None of that had ever really mattered to her. What mattered was that she'd remembered who she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone bury that again. Back at her apartment, she dusted off an old box from the back of her closet. Inside were yellowing sheet music, a chipped metronome, a stack of journals from her early 20s, and a photo of her mother sitting at an upright piano, eyes closed, hands mid-chord. That night, Beverly played until the neighbors knocked on the wall. She played every song she hadn't let herself touch in years. Pieces she thought she'd forgotten came back with ease. Others she stumbled through and laughed at, quietly but freely. And after a week of late-night sessions and early morning reflection, she made a decision. She called the Arts Council back, then the music school. She even returned a call from a woman who wanted to write a feature on her for a regional magazine. One by one, she reconnected. Not for fame, not for applause, but because maybe her gift could still serve a purpose. 2 months later, Beverly was teaching piano lessons twice a week at a community center in Garden City. Most of her students were kids from working-class homes. A few adults, too, women who'd always wanted to play but never had the chance. She was patient, direct, and kind. She never talked about Charles Whitlow, never mentioned the party. But word got around. One day, after a lesson, a girl named Nia, barely 10 years old, all elbows and braids, looked up from the keys and asked, "Miss Beverly, were you really a maid in that big house on Prospect Lane?" Beverly smiled. "I was. Did they make you play?" "No, baby," she said gently. "They tried to make a fool of me, but I decided what they were gonna get." Nia looked confused for a second, then grinned. "You're kinda famous now," Beverly chuckled. "I'm just someone who remembered who she was. That's better than famous." She walked home that day with her shoulders back and her head high. Not because of pride, but because there was no weight left to carry. Behind her, Charles Whitlow still threw parties. But word had spread about what happened that summer evening. People remembered the way Beverly played, the silence that followed, the way a room full of money couldn't touch a woman with nothing to prove. Some said Whitlow had changed since then. Slightly. He drank more, laughed less. A few regular guests stopped showing up altogether, but Beverly didn't waste thought on any of that. She had music to teach, students to encourage, and a life that finally belonged to her. Not many people get a second chance to claim the parts of themselves they left behind. But sometimes, if you stay quiet long enough, the world gives you one moment to speak loud. And Beverly used hers with grace. Because power doesn't always look like the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it sounds like a song that no one saw coming, and it leaves people wondering why they ever doubted you at all. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you were less than you are, remember Beverly Gaines. And when your moment comes, play it like it was always yours. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.